Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm going to give you all a moment to join. I just wanted to do general hellos and that I miss everybody. Already I would be looking forward to the year's events. And so at least we're joining together here. I'm Lindsay Adler. If you don't know, I am a portrait and fashion photographer, and I'm actually here in my studio. And I was excited to be able to share because I feel like it's been forever. So I hope everyone's keeping well and that you're finding ways to connect and to continue learning during all of this. So thank you again for joining me. To give you a little perspective about what I want to talk about today is the idea behind making art with a single light. And I think what happens to people is in photography, we all get caught up on, I don't know, I can't help it, the nerd stuff, like what lens, what camera, okay, exactly what technical elements, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. And while it is definitely important, the key word that I wanted to emphasize here is the art of it. And you can make stunning, like incredible art with natural light. And so if you're looking to get into the world of studio lighting, the benefit of studio lighting is control. And so if you look at my work and you look at my portfolio, it is all about control. I control every element, the background, the pose, the expression, the hair, the makeup, the wardrobe, like all of it. And so that's one of the powerful elements of studio lighting is that every single thing is up to you. But what's great about that is there are endless possibilities, even if you only have one light. Now, there are a lot of photographers that like to make excuses. I think you probably know some of these people, maybe you're one of them, about I don't have this expensive piece of gear, or I only have one light, or whatever it may be. But guess what? I mean, simple modifiers and just understanding one light is what really matters. So that's what we're going to cover in today's webinar. So I am going to pop over right now and give you a demonstration or give you a presentation all about the control that you can have with one light. So let's pop over and do that right now. All right, perfect. Okay, guys. So here's the thing. One light can do more than you imagine. I'm gonna throw a little bit of shade here, just like a little bit. There are a lot of photo tutorials out there that are all about using one light. Like I mean, at a lot of conferences and a lot of YouTube videos, and then they'll show the results of what they created with one light, and it is the most boring portrait ever. Like, I mean, that's the thing is it doesn't have to be boring, and I just see so much out there that is. So I wanted to give you all some inspiration of what you can really achieve with one light. So every single image in this entire presentation, every single one that you see was created with one light. If you're looking at that, you're like, no, there's a rim light. No, it was one light. It was probably a reflector. Or if you're like, oh, wait, it looks like a background light. Nope, it was the one light hitting the subject and spilling on the background. So if it's in here, it was done with one light. So for example, just to show you a couple images here, guess what? These done with one light. These photographs done with one light. And these done with one light. So you'll see that there's everything from high contrast black and white to poppy and colorful to pastel, ethereal, and everything in between. So I think the most important thing I want you to take away with of my purpose here is that one light can be boring or it can be absolutely magnificent. It can be incredible. And that part's up to you. So if the idea that you put in front of the camera is bad, like you're not going to get a good shoot. So we're going to revisit that a little bit later. So when you're using one light, it is all about understanding the tools available to control that one light. If you don't understand how to use that one light, how to control it, to shape it, to sculpt it, then your pictures will just look mediocre because you didn't have the control. And so that's kind of the reason that a lot of people come into the studio. I think that sometimes the images suffer is because now there's no excuses. And it's not like with soft light that you do with natural light stepping outdoors. Like everything looks decent. It might not look wow, but it looks decent. But as soon as you're in the studio, that control is on your shoulder. So here's the tools that are really important to understand. And this is what we're going to cover throughout this presentation. When you have one light, you control that light with the modifiers or how you modify that light, which could actually be light shapers like umbrellas and beauty dishes and things like that, or it could be bouncing a light, for example. The next is the distance of light, which means both the distance of the light to the subject as well as the distance to the background. The position of light, which means side to side, kind of around your subject, up and down. Reflectors that you use in the scene, could be silver, could be white, could be a V flat, could be a wall. And then other things, which is kind of my specialty, what I like to get into is feathering and gobos. So things that go between the light and the subject. So that is what we're going to dive into. Now, by the way, I'm going to share a ton with you today, as much as I can. We do have a course dedicated to this topic. And if you go to lindsayadler.photo/one light and you use the code PHOTOPLUS21, you can get 25% off. So there's a video course and there's also a lighting recipe guide. So I have more than 20 different one light setups where they all completely different and explores different concepts. So I think that would be a good place to start if you're looking to get inspired. But let's get on to the webinar because I'm going to just try to throw as much information your way as possible. So let's begin with modifying light. So modifying light basically means changing the quality of the light. Now, when we talk about quality of light, usually the categories fall into hard or soft light. But of course, there's everything in between. There's really soft light, there's kind of soft light, there's hard light, there's super honey light. And so I want to show you what it means when we're talking about this. So picture on the left is hard light, picture on the right is soft light. But if you are new to these terms or really kind of figuring out what they mean, the things I'm looking at there's a couple elements. First of all, I'm looking at the shadows. Do you see the shadow cast by her nose on the left-hand side? See how it's really crisp, it's really defined. Whereas the picture on the right, it's a subtle gradient. So when you're using hard light, it is a very crisp transition from shadow to highlight. The shadow edges are sharp. You can also look at the shadow on the neck as another example of where to see this. Now, when you look at the forehead, another element of hard light is it tends to be more specular. Basically, it means that the reflections from the main light, they're shiny. You see a little bit of texture. And so you'll see that on the skin. Now, here's the thing. Let me just zoom in close so you can examine this a little bit more. In which photograph does her skin look, quote unquote, better? I would probably say 99% of people would probably see the picture on the right. Her skin looks smoother. The textures are a little bit more downplayed. But here's the thing. Hard light has a place. And so many photographers, they're taught only about soft light. But when you have hard light, you have such control. You can play around with shadows. You can cast shadows on the face. The light can throw to both the subject and the background, and you can cast shadows on one, not the other. So I want to make sure you don't discount hard light as an option when you're trying to imagine so many different capabilities with one light. Yeah, I can achieve that because I don't just automatically throw out hard light. I'm not only using large soft boxes, for example. So don't forget that. And we're going to revisit that a little bit later. Now, when you make light hard, soft, or something in between, there are three main ways you modify it: direct light, diffuse light, and bounce light. Now, if you've been a speed light photographer in the past, for example, you may have heard this before. Basically, if you had your speed light pointed directly at the subject, well, that's going to be direct light. If it's diffused, you might put one on one of those little like boxes in the front of it, kind of like a mini softbox that diffuses it, or bounced if you take that speed light and you bounce it off the ceiling. Same rules apply with both modifiers. What the modifiers are doing, like an umbrella, for example, is bouncing the light, or something like a zoom reflector is direct light. So let's take a look at this. Direct light implies that the light source is directly hitting the subject with nothing in between, and so it's going to create hard light. Diffuse light means something is in between the subject and the light. So when the light hits it, it kind of spreads out and it softens it a bit. Now, in the middle example, what I did is I took a 3-in-1 reflector diffuser. So I took off the reflection part, held up the diffuser, it hit the diffusion panel, it becomes a softer light source. If you compare the left and the middle, obviously it's much softer. But then looking over at the right-hand side, you can see that it is even softer still with bounced light. Now, the reason this is true is obviously not every situation bounce light will be softer. It's not always the case. But the picture on the right, I bounced the light source into a large V flat. Basically, think of it as a large white wall. When the light bounces off of that light source or off of the wall or the large white surface, it becomes that size. So it's going to be a huge light source, which makes it really soft, which we're going to talk about as well. Now, the reason that I wanted to bring this up, here's the closer, by the way, one more time. Now, the reason I wanted to bring this up is modifiers are an important way to change the quality of light. And if you look at what the modifier is doing, that'll help you determine if it's going to be a hard light source, more specular, harder shadows. If it's going to be soft, it's going to be super soft. So for example, something like a zoom reflector, a bare bulb, or magnum reflector, that'll all give you hard specular light. Things that are diffused would be something like a scrim or a softbox, right? The diffusion material is that material on the front of a softbox. Something that's bounced is a beauty dish or an umbrella. And then you can do multiple of these things to make it even softer, like an umbrella with diffusion is both bounced and diffused. So when you're thinking about your goals for the image, what you're trying to do with the light, consider if you're trying to achieve hard light, soft light, something in between, super soft, and it will help you start to figure out which one of these modifiers might be a good choice for you. Now, of course, you can't forget considerations like budget and compactness, size of your studio, if it needs to be portable, all of those things, of course, you still have to think about. All right, so next up, as we are talking about modifying light, changing the quality of light, we also have to talk about distance of light. Distance of light does two crazy important things that when you're only using one light, this is something that you have to think about. Like, I can't stress how important this is. I used to think distance of light was more just based on the size of my space. Like, okay, I'll just put it a few feet back so it's not in my photo. But it's so much more important than that. When you are working with just one strobe, your distance of light affects the quality of light. You can make it harder or softer by your distance, which is going to be really important if you only have one, maybe two modifiers, because you can change the quality by the distance. And then the other thing that's going to make a huge difference is the fall off of light. Basically, how much light hits the background. If you are only using one light, do you see why this is so important? If you want more light to reach the background, or you want less light to reach the background, like distance of light is going to be one of the most important things. So you have to consider both. So we do definitely have to dive into this a little bit more. So let's take a look at this really important thing to remember. The larger the light source is relative to the size of the subject, the softer the light. Okay, so again, the larger the light source is compared to the size of the subject, the softer the light. So what that means, it basically translates to this. If you bring the light closer to the subject, it gets softer. If you grab a bigger modifier, it gets softer. If you grab a big modifier and you bring it super close, it'll be even softer. And of course, the opposite is true. So, right, you pull the light further away, it'll get harder. If you take a smaller modifier, it'll get harder. If you take a small modifier, it'll go further away, it gets even harder. So keep this in mind. It's not just about like, oh, okay, I took my modifier, it was kind of in my shot, I backed it up. No, it's not just about it not being in your shot anymore. You changed the quality of it when you did this. Now, it might not have ruined the shot, but you need to know that it makes a difference, especially when you're using a single light. So for example, the picture on the left is a 3-foot octabox, kind of far away from the subject. Let's say it's 8-10 feet. And then when I move it closer, so I'm having it more like 3 feet away from the subject, 2 feet away from the subject. If you look at the edge of the shadows and the specularity on the forehead, you see how that middle photo, as I brought the 3-foot octabox closer, it got softer. So even just moving a 3-foot octabox from 8 feet to 3 feet, it makes a difference, a huge difference in the quality of light. Now, the picture on the far right is another illustration of switching modifiers to achieve something similar. So I went from a 3-foot octabox to a 5-foot octabox. But in this case, I put the 5-foot octabox kind of like 6-ish feet away, and see how it looks kind of pretty similar, maybe even softer than the middle photo, because the larger the light source is relative to the size of the subject, the softer the light. So get a bigger modifier if you want it to be softer, or bring the one that you have closer. Both of those will make the light softer. Now, going back to my love of hard light, so many people ignore hard light. They don't use it as a tool, but I regularly create really sunny looking images in my studio. Like the subject is bathed in sunlight, or I play with shadows. So if I want really hard light, what can I do? Well, I could take off the modifiers altogether, make it hard, or maybe add a zoom reflector to control the spill of light a little bit better. And then I could back it up as far as I can in my space. The further away I can get it, the harder that light source will become. So you just have to keep this in mind because it's all about the control. All right, so I said the first thing that you have to consider with your distance of light, of course, is your quality of light. But this is the big doozy. This is the one that stresses people. Don't get stressed out, okay? I'm gonna explain the important elements here. But the distance of your light to both your subject and your background controls the amount of light on the background. Now, this is something called the inverse square law. People usually say, you double the distance, quarter the power. Basically, here's how I think of it. If you double the distance of, let's say, your light to your subject, right? You double the distance. So you take the light from 2 feet to 4 feet away. I think logically we think, oh, we doubled the distance. The power will be half as much. No, it didn't go half as much. A quarter as much. Light falls off much more rapidly than you think it does. It gets darker much more quickly than you would even imagine. So fall off of light is going to be really important. Now, I am going to explain this here. I am going to show it to you. But I go through this much more in depth in 2 classes that I have. One of the classes, of course, is the One Light class that I'm referring to here. And then I also have a 15-hour video lighting tutorial class called Master Studio Light, where I go into this like super, super, super in depth. But don't be overwhelmed. It's more about the practical use of it. So here's what you have to remember. So light, it falls off more quickly than you think. So to darken the background, there are 2 things you can do if you want to control this background. So first of all, if you move the subject and the light further from the background, you take your subject, you take the light, and you move further away. What happens is the light and the subject are further away from the background, so less of that light reaches the background. I think of it kind of like throwing a bucket of water. If you take that bucket of water and you back up several feet, well, when you throw it, not as much water is going to reach the background. So that one is pretty logical. That one makes sense. Here's where it gets a little more confusing. Let's say you backed up, okay? So you backed up several feet with your subject and your light. The background got darker, but you're looking at it and you're backed up as far as you can get in your space. Like there's nowhere else to go, but you want that background to be even darker. Well, one of the things you can do is you can actually take where your light is and your subject and scoot your subject closer to the light. Now, when you do that, when the subject moves closer to the light, they become brighter. Okay. So it got brighter. And then what you have to do is you can change your aperture. You could change your ISO, whatever you got to do. Basically you have to darken down, right? You have to let less light in, or you turn down the power of the light so that the subject is correctly exposed. When you do that, the background will now appear darker. Okay. Because basically think of it this way. They moved closer and you had to compensate to get the correct exposure on them. But the amount of light that was hitting the background, it didn't change. So now when you close down your aperture, for example, that background will appear darker. That's what you have to keep in mind. And then of course, all of the opposite is true. So if you move your subject and the light closer to the background, it gets brighter. And then if you move your subject further away from the light and you compensate, okay, then the background looks brighter. So this is the inverse square law in practice. Okay, so I'm just going to show you. I'm just going to kind of talk through this, show you this in action. This is actually from the One Light tutorial, just to give you an idea. But okay, so I'm actually using a white background in this example, but it appears gray. And the reason is the subject is 10 feet away from the background and the light is about 2.5 feet away. So basically the light and the subject, they're relatively far away. Light's not reaching the background, so it appears gray. Now, notice the difference here. I went from medium gray to a little bit darker gray. Because what we did is we took the light, same distance from the subject, right? Okay, so let's say this is our background over here. So we have our subject and our light, and we just scooted both of them a little bit further away from the background. So you notice here's before, here's after, it gets a little bit darker. But then if I'm looking at this and I'm going, oh man, I want it darker. I want it darker even slightly. I would like it to look close to black. Well, what did I just say we could do? Got the light and the subject, so we move them back. Well, now you could take the subject, move them closer to the light, compensate with your exposure. Now the background's going to appear darker. So now watch what happens. When I moved the subject a foot forward, a foot closer to the light, I didn't change the distance of the light to the background, but the background still appears darker because we compensated for the brighter light on the subject. Make sense? All right, now let's go the opposite. All right, so now what I did is I took both the light and the subject, put them back to their normal distances, 2.5 feet between the light and the subject. I took it and I scooted them back towards the background. So now only 5 feet away from the background, and therefore the background got remarkably much, much brighter. Okay, one more thing. Now Notice how I can make the background start to appear white when I put the subject right up against the background. And then I pull the light away just a little bit. So now what's happening is when I expose correctly for the subject, there's no fall off of light. It's not like there's a big difference between the light on the subject and the background. It's the same. So it's going to be brighter. It's going to be the actual white or close to white that the background is. So that's what the inverse square law is, and that's how you use it. So far, we have talked about our modifiers. We've talked about quality of light. We've talked about the distance of light. So the distance of light affecting both the quality of light and the inverse square law. So the amount of spill, how you control your background. So now we're going to pop over and talk a little bit about the position of the light. Okay, now, one of the things I want to tell you is we're going to go through here and I'm going to talk a bit about terminology. Some of the common phrases that you will hear in lighting. And here's the thing, knowing lighting terms, it doesn't make you a better photographer, so don't be overwhelmed. But the reason it's really useful to know is because it allows you to talk about light. Like we can speak the same language. So when I say, okay, so it's in a loop lighting position and then there's a kicker light, right? Then you know what I'm talking about. So just know I'm using this so that we can describe light, but it's really just a tool of communication. So let's talk about position of light, okay? All right, so position of light. We're talking about two things really. We're talking about the lighting side to side, kind of around the subject. We're also talking about the height of the light. Basically, think of it like this. Anytime you move the light off axis from the camera, okay, moving it off to the side, moving it up, moving it down, you're going to introduce more shadows. You're going to see more shadows into the scene. And so basically the flattest light you can get is when your subject is facing straight on, you have the light super centered and super low. Like that is going to be as minimal sculpting as possible. If you guys ever seen the egg example, it's like a white or gray background with an egg. And when you light it from the front, the egg just kind of blends in. It has no shape. It looks flat and two-dimensional. But as you move the light off to the side or you move it up, it introduces more shadows. I remember when I first saw that example, I was like, wait, I don't understand the point. But basically, like just anywhere you move the light, side to side, up and down, it creates more shadows to the shot. That's really the point of that. So in this example, the first image on the left is what we call paramount lighting position. Now, you might have also heard of butterfly lighting. Butterfly lighting tends to happen when that light it's in this example, the light is centered perfectly in front of its nose. Okay, so you see that little shadow underneath the nose. If you raise that light up just a little bit, it'll actually cast a shadow underneath the nose. It gets a little bit longer and it will look, depending on the shape of the subject's nostrils, it'll look kind of like a little butterfly, hence butterfly lighting. But paramount lighting is when this light is centered to the face. Then you have loop. And fundamentally what that means is you took that main light and you moved it a little bit off to the side and the nose creates a little loop shadow. Then if you keep going and you move the light a little bit further, the shadow of the cheek and the shadow of the nose, will they meet? And it creates a triangle of light underneath the eye. And then lastly, you move that light so far off to the side that it becomes split light. So half of the subject's face is lit and the other half of the face is in shadow. So these terms aren't, again, like they're not an end all be all. Like you might have the shadow of the nose almost Rembrandt, but not quite. And so which one is it? Like it doesn't really matter. Like it's not a make or break. It's like a loop is better than Rembrandt or vice versa. But it's just terms to describe lighting. Okay, but here's what I want you to know. This is not telling you the position of light in the scene exactly. It's not like, okay, so in paramount light, light is always going to be flat on to the camera. It's actually relative to the face. So imagine this. Got a light here, centered on my face. You guys, the camera, right? In this instance, paramount lighting, it's going to look like that picture on the far left. What happens if I rotate this way? And the light moved around with me. So the light is almost completely to the side, but no matter where my face turned, it's still technically paramount lighting on my face. However, as I move to the side, and the light moves to the side, you're going to start seeing more and more and more and more and more shadow here. So first of all, the distance of the light off axis to the camera creates more shadow, but also it does make a difference, the position of the face. Because all of a sudden, let's say over here, my face is in paramount lighting, and then I look back to you now, it's actually split lighting. half of my face is being lit and the other half isn't. So it is both the position of the light as well as the position of the subject's face that help, introduce that sculpting into the scene. So all of these images are using a different position of light, different terminology. And so you start to be able to piece apart, based on what we've talked about, what is going on in this shot, so like what's being achieved here. So for example, we've talked about the quality of light and how you modify light. Well, the picture on the left, that's very soft light. And you can see it by looking at the shadow transitions. Look at the shadow by the nose and the neck. It's very, very gradual. Also, the shadows aren't very dark, which is telling me that there's probably a bounce, something filling in the shadows on the left-hand side. Now, the light on her face, I would say on that left-hand picture with the beige tones, it is in a loop lighting position. Basically, the light is off to the right-hand side. That's where you see the highlight on her cheek. You see a shadow on the left-hand side of the face and just a little shadow cast by her nose. Didn't matter that it was loop or Rembrandt. It's just a way for me to describe it to you. Okay, how about the next one in the middle? Well, if you look at the shadow from her nose and her neck, if you look at that, well, it's telling me that that is split light, right? Half of her face is illuminated, the other half is in shadow. Now, you may wonder how I achieved the background element. So the fact that the background's half white and half black. Well, on the left-hand side, I put a white V-flat, so a white piece of foam core right behind her. So that it was divided down the middle so that I would get that kind of checkerboard lighting. So it's white in the background against the shadows of her face and the highlights of her face against the darkness of the background. And then over on the right-hand side here, I actually want to show you a little bit more about that photo, because this is where you get into extreme angles and position of light. Now, this will make a difference depending on what space you are working in. Almost everything that I've showed you, you could work and shoot in a smaller space. However, notice here how we've moved the light far off to the side and raised it up really high. If her chin was not turned towards the light and lifted up, there would be no light on her face. Like if she was looking straight on camera, it would just be dark. There'd be nothing. She'd have some highlights on her head, which maybe with her awesome hairstyle, like you could do something cool with. But my point is that the position of the light and the pose of the subject together, especially if you're going for the one light artistry thing. If you're not just like creating a headshot, right? You're actually trying to sculpt the light, then pose and light position all work together. By the way, I just want to train your eye to see position of light in the scene. Look at her arm in the picture on the left. Do you see how there's a little bit of separation there on her arm? See that little highlight? That's what that white reflector is doing. Now, by the way, the reflector I'm using in this case, it's a large piece of foam core, but there's a company called V-Flat World that actually makes portable V-Flats, which is really nice if you're shooting in a smaller space because they collapse down. And then you can also put them in your car, that kind of thing. So yes, a shot is for a larger space, but it does need to be. You could take, in this case, it's a large umbrella with diffusion, but you could take a 3-foot octabox, put it in a similar position, and then use the pop-up V-flat or a white reflector for a similar result. All right, now, this is one of my favorites. This is something that I think people don't realize how extreme you can go. Feathering the light is fantastic. Basically, it's changing where the light is pointed. Like, is the center of the light pointed at the subject? Is it pointed more towards the ground? Is it pointed towards the background? Is it pointed away from the background? Like a common example is people will feather things to or away from the background. You're basically controlling when you have that bucket of water, well, where are you pointing it when you're throwing it? That's basically what we're talking about here. These two photos were lit identically, same modifier. The light was in the exact same position, like on the ground relative to the subject. The only thing that changed is where I angled or pointed that light. Now, what I saw on the left, what I felt is when I was looking at this shot, I felt like the background was, it was kind of competing with her. Like the highlights on the jacket were matching the color of the background. And I really wanted the highlights of the jacket to be what came forward. So what I did is I took the light source and I pointed it less at the background. And then I was looking at the floor, and the floor was actually a little distracting. So guess what? You don't have to point the center of the light at the subject's face. That's what people miss. You can actually point the light up and away. And so I feel like this will be really surprising to a lot of people. Look where the light's pointed. It is not pointed at her like at all. at all. The light is pointed way up so it doesn't hit the ground, and it's feathered away from the background. But that's how I created that really sculpted look. I love the shot. It's on my Instagram, and it's all about control of light. It was a soft light source with a lot of careful feathering to see exactly where the light fell. So using the edge of the light is not a problem. You're still getting soft light. It's not like you're getting a hard light source because you're taking an umbrella and using the edge of it. Okay, so now speaking of hard versus soft light, hard light is one of those things that I really think gets a bad rap. And the reason is the harder light source emphasizes texture and wrinkles on the skin. It's true. If you want your shots to have the skin that looks perfect straight out of camera, then yeah, softer light, bounced and diffused light, bounce and diffuse light with a reflector. Like these are all things that help you get better results straight away, straight out of camera. But when you switch over to hard light, because hard light has a crisper shadow edge, a more defined shadow edge, you can create sculpted images like the picture on the right. The picture on the right was done with one light, bare bulb, and something to cast a shadow. No special modifiers. It's nothing overly complicated, but it's understanding how light works, which is the entire point of one light. So remember, hard light creates crisp shadow edges. And so what we're going to do is we're going to use something called flags and gobos. Basically, flags block light where you don't want it to be, and a gobo goes between the light and the subject. You to cast a creative shadow. It's a gobo, that's what I mean. So both of these images were created with one light, just one light, nothing else. Can you guess how I created the picture on the left? Giving you like a second to think about it. Well, I already told you hard light, right? So I used a bare bulb and I pulled it really far away from the subject, because the further away that I could move it, the harder the light source would be. But then how did I create that sliver of light? Well, we're going back to my V-flats again. I set up 2 V-flats and I put them so they were just like an inch, 2 inches away from each other. So it created this little beam of light. Now, there was no light on the background. However, I put her on a white background, and because the light was bare bulb, it bounced around the scene just enough to kiss the background and give it a little bit of light so that it wouldn't go completely black. But it's knowing about hard light. Now, how about the picture on the right? How to create that? Most people guessed a snoot or a specialty modifier like a spot projector or maybe a grid. No, it's none of those things. I took a piece of cardboard and cut a hole in it and put it in between the light and the subject. That's it. A black piece of cardboard with a hole in it. So let me show you kind of how this works. All right, so in the instance that I have here, I'm using a bare bulb off to the right-hand side of the frame. Now, what I did is I had my subject pose in a way that her face would catch the light, but it would create that Rembrandt light on the left-hand side of the frame. So you can see there's that little triangle of light underneath her eyes. So it's purposely posing her in that way. But then what was happening is her shoulder was really bright and her ear on the right-hand side, that was really bright, and I wanted to darken it down. So what we did is we introduced something called cinefoil. Now, cinefoil is basically black tinfoil. It's used for lighting, but it didn't have to be cinefoil. I could have used a black piece of cardboard, just anything to block the light. And then what we did is we moved it close to the subject so that we cast a shadow on her ear and her back. Basically, we blocked the light from where we didn't want to get it. Now, how about the background? Okay, the background appears almost pure white. Well, first of all, we had the subject relatively close to the background, maybe 3 feet away. And because we had the hard light source relatively far away, it was spilling on the background. So some of that water in the bucket was hitting the background. Now, in truth, the picture straight out of camera appeared like a little bit gray, like the background wasn't quite white, but I already knew that I was going for a high contrast black and white. So when I popped that contrast, the background instantly went white. If I had wanted it to be pure white, I would have had to bring her a little bit closer to the background and then taken that light and moved it a little bit further away, and it would have gotten a little bit more spill onto the background without me having to do any post work. So I wanted to give you one more trick, and I talk about this more in the video, but just to touch on it a little bit. When you have something that is casting a shadow on the subject, The harder the light, the more defined that shadow will be. So this is an instance where actually, even though I'm very much a strobe shooter, most of the time I'm shooting with studio strobes. Speed lights are awesome because speed lights unmodified are super hard light sources. So if you're playing around with this and you've got a speed light, this is actually a perfect time to bring it out, is to play with shadows. And the other thing is, if you've got a little bit of room, back that light up, like further away you can get it, the harder it will be. But one more trick that you'll see this when you practice with it, the closer you can get that gobo or flag to your subject, the more defined the line will be. Now, I actually didn't mind the fact that the shadow, like you see the shadow on the side of her face, it wasn't super, super defined, the one that's cast by the cinefoil, because I was hoping that the shadow edge would match what's similar to the shadow cast by her nose and the side of her face. But if I wanted it to be razor sharp, we would have taken that cinefoil and brought it real close to her. I'm talking inches, just barely out of frame. And it would have been a more defined shadow edge. So it's a fun trick. Play with it. You'll see what I mean. I go into that more as well. All right. So let's come back around to the idea of concept. I think one of the most important things that takes a photographer from being like good and competent to being wow is that they had a concept. And this doesn't mean you have to be a fine art photographer or a fashion photographer. You absolutely can do this with portraiture. It's what was the purpose going into that shoot, and then use that to help you determine everything else. I can't emphasize that enough. If you just point a light at something and the person just showed up, the picture can only get so good. It kind of depends on then, like, well, how did your subject look when they showed up? And that's not what you should be relying on. I think if you can do some prep work and put something amazing in front of your camera and then decide what lighting is going to best flatter that and what background is going to be best, like that's how you get images that are wow, that really stand out. So here's what you need to do. Just determine the purpose of your image first. Is it meant to be strong and graphic? Is it meant to be aggressive? Is it meant to show texture? What's the purpose of it? And then everything else should support that. The lighting supports it, the background, the makeup, the hair, the props, like everything. But you have to start with the purpose, because if you don't know the purpose and the concept, then how do you know what else to do? So you have to start there. When you have a concept, that's when the magic happens. It really does. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some concepts. I'm going to show you some examples of what we went into with the shoot, how I chose the light, and how it was informed by the concept. Again, it's not just like, for me, I don't just pull out a large umbrella for every single shot, point it at the scene and go, boom, there's my soft light, there's my portrait. Like I try to sculpt it a little bit more. So the concept for this image was that I wanted to create kind of a Baroque or Renaissance painting. Now, many of these paintings were using window light as their light source, right? And so I knew that meant that it had to be soft light. Like I could not do an image with hard light and have it make sense. So I needed a soft light source. But I also know that window light, it bounces around a lot. When you're looking in a room, it's not usually that window light hits the subject and then the shadows are really dark. Usually it's bouncing off the floors or the ceilings or the walls and it fills in the shadows. So I knew that I probably wanted a little bit of either a reflector, or maybe if there was a wall close, I could use that. Then, of course, let's talk about hair and wardrobe. This obviously makes a big difference. I wanted something that looked romantic, that looked painterly. And so we had amazing hair and makeup and wardrobe to bring that to life. And then I even selected a pose that reinforced that it was based on a painting or inspired by a painting. And so this is what it looked like in the scene. Now, I used a large umbrella with diffusion as my light source because it's easy to set up. I struggle when I set up really large octoboxes. I don't know if anybody else struggles with that, like the 5-foot or 7-foot octoboxes are just a pain to put together. So I usually go with a large or extra large umbrella because it's just easier. And it still gives me the soft light source that I wanted. And then I took a white reflector and put it on the right-hand side of the scene. Now, if you have an extra hand, someone there to hold it, great, they could just hold it. But here I'm using a Westcott reflector holding arm. They actually sell these. So people ask me all the time, what do I do if I don't have an assistant? Well, get something just like this. Okay, let's move on to our next concept. The next concept was my significant other had gotten me a book by one of my favorite photographers, Herb Ritz, and he did a lot of portraits where the subject was bathed in sunlight, often on a white background, super high contrast, just just gorgeous and luxurious. And so I wanted to do something like that in the studio. And so what I did is I created a white background. He shot on white backgrounds all the time. So I put up a white seamless paper background. And then I brought the subject really close to the background, and I decided that I wanted to incorporate her shadow as part of the composition. I figured if you could see the curves of her body and you could see that in the shadow, it would make for an interesting composition. But then what I needed to do is create hard light. So what do you do for hard light? Hard light modifier, direct light. So it could have been a zoom reflector maybe, or a magnum reflector. Well, in this case, I went bare bulb, and then I backed it up as far as I could get it in the studio. And that's what allowed me to create this really hard light on her face, and also on the background as well. But let's go the exact opposite direction. So the concept for this shot is I wanted something dreamy and ethereal. And so I, of course, began with the styling. I wanted the makeup to be soft. That's why you see the pinks in her lips and this really soft makeup on her eyes, rather than going for something strong or colorful or really structural. And then, of course, wardrobes. We had this beautiful feather top that creates something very angelic, kind of dreamlike. Then, of course, her posing. You can see that in her posing. I created something that soft hands, soft fingers, curving lines, right? So I had the concept, and that's what determines everything else in the scene. Now, the lighting here is actually a light through a bed sheet behind her and then bounced into white V-flats. So a white wall or white V-flats just to bounce the light and make it super, super soft. Okay, now this one I love. It's a good example. I actually have a how-to up on my YouTube channel, which I recommend, guys. I come out with a YouTube video every week, and it's about a variety of things, from lighting to portraiture to just a wide range of how-tos, retouching. I go through my photos and I break them down. I show you how it was done. So in this image, I think it looks like there's many lights in the scene, but there's just one. Okay, so let me show you how. First and foremost, I needed a hard light source. In this instance, I used something called a magnum reflector. It's just a bigger zoom reflector. It's wider. And I actually have a video on my YouTube that goes specifically through what is a magnum reflector and how to use it. So I have a magnum reflector on her face to make it look like sunshine. All right, so that's the first light source. Okay, now how did I make it look like there's a rim light? See how there's a rim light on the left-hand side of her face? Well, I took a silver reflector on that little stand with that little arm, held it to the left-hand side of the frame, and then caught some of the light from the magnum reflector so that it would kiss on the side of her face and her temple. So I thought that gave it a little bit of a more depth, more polish. And how about the background? Because now it looks like there's a light on the background. Well, what I did is the magnum reflector actually throws light quite far. So what we did is we backed the subject up so that they were close to the background. And because the angle of the light was quite high, I wanted it to look like a sunny day, so the sun would be higher in the sky. It didn't light behind her head, but it lit kind of behind her shoulders. So it looks like a background light, a main light, and a rim light, but it's really just one light. It's one hard light, in this case, a magnum reflector. I mean, this shot is clearly all about the concept. And so my wardrobe stylist was awesome. This isn't actually a shirt. It's a piece of fabric that he sculpted. He basically took a piece of fabric and he folded it and shaped it, and it was awesome. And then the awesome hairstylist also went for sculptural. So the idea was, let's make this dramatic with the hair, dramatic with the wardrobe. Let's make it sculptural. Let's make it drama. And all this is a beauty dish. That's it. But there's no secret to it. It's that I didn't have it flat on because I wanted to create some shape and drama. If I had it flat on and had a big soft light source that was really broad, then it wouldn't have wrapped around the textures of the fabric and the textures of the hair or sculpted her face and created the drama. So that's how I decided to go that direction. But I felt that if I went for a really hard light source, it might have popped the highlights too much, for example, on the fabric, and it would have become a distraction rather than being something that's beautiful and velvety. Okay, another shot. Can you guess the position of the light? If you take a look at this for a moment, where do you think the light was located? And you can kind of see it based on the light on the top of her cheekbones. You see it on the top of her clavicles. I mean, it's obviously got to be a relatively high light source. Now, the inspiration for this shot was incredible, prolific, endlessly talented Irving Penn. And he shot a lot of portraits where he would take a corner, he'd put the subjects in the corner. It was really cool. There's a lot of psychology behind, how they would stand, and whether they would shrink in the corner, they'd own that corner. So that was my inspiration. I took 2 canvas backgrounds, put them in a V, and then you can kind of see the behind the scenes here. And I actually do this in the One Light guide, my One Light video and guide. What I wanted to draw attention to is inspired by Irving Penn. I wanted to create something sculptural. So the light is super high up, but notice her chin is lifted towards that light and it rakes down across her body. It's super dramatic. It's also feathered a little bit towards the background so that a little bit of light hits the background. If I feather it away, then the background would go totally dark and she would blend in a little bit. So I'm actually using the angle of my light to control the spill of the light in the scene. So that word that I just said is so important. It's control. I think if you don't have control over one light, if you don't understand how the modifiers and the quality of light and the distance of light and feathering and flags and gobos, if you don't understand how all of those things work together, then how can you possibly bring your concept to life? If you don't understand the control, you're basically just throwing a light at the scene. And that's why a lot of people get intimidated about getting creative in the studio. But I think people also use the excuse of not having a lot of gear to hold them back from being creative. So it's about having a concept and then understanding how you can control that one light. And that's what makes those really wow one light images. So guys, I would love to answer some of your questions. And I think the types of questions that would be appropriate would be things like if there's certain modifiers that you've wanted to you're considering getting, or what's the best one to start with, or if you're struggling with something in the studio, or you've run across a certain challenge over and over again, those types of things. But I'm open to pretty much anything. So if you drop them into the chat, I would be more than happy to answer them. And by the way, if you want to see my One Light recipe guide as well as video tutorial, if you go to lindsayadler.photo/one light, this is valid until January 31st. All right, so let me pop over and see if I can get some of these questions. Okay, perfect. Okay, so the first question from Janice was that, is the One Light Artistry recipe guide available separate from the One Light class? And yes, it is. Let me see. I actually have a separate link for that. I'm going to look it up real quick. I think it's instead of /one light, I think it's /one light guide, which I'll just test that right now and make sure I'm not lying about that. But let me know if you have any other questions while I do that. I think I'm not lying about that. One Light guide. Yay. Okay, cool. Yep. lindsayadler.photo/one light guide will get you just that. Okay, let's pop back over and see what other questions we've got going on here. Okay, so that first question was for Janice. Next one is Sean. What would you suggest for a portable modifier and a portable battery operated light? I've been looking at the AD200. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about your portable modifier. I love umbrellas. I use umbrellas in the studio all the time. However, if you're talking about portable, literally on location, umbrellas become sails. And so I often recommend to people something like a Rapid Box. Rapid Box Octa, for example, is a quick pop-up modifier made by Westcott that is made for portable use. I think that's a really good one. Also, if you like the quality of light from a beauty dish, for example, there are collapsible portable beauty dishes, which are really, really nice. Westcott makes one. ProPhoto has theirs as well. That kind of more depends on your budget. Now, for the question about the battery operated light, well, this is another budget question as well. I shoot with the ProPhoto B10 or the B10 Plus because I like the output, but I know a ton of people that have the AD200 and are super, super happy with it. I just personally have never tried it, so I can't advise on that one in particular. I think what's most important for you to consider is what your purpose is for it, and then how many watt seconds of power do you need. So The reason I go with the ProPhoto B10 Plus is because it's 500 watt seconds, which gives me a lot of light. So if I am trying to have enough output to match some light from the sun, or have my subject a little further away, or maybe I'm going through a big soft modifier, which bounces the light and diffuses it, that cuts a lot of light. And so maybe having a little bit more power is helpful. I personally wouldn't go lower than 250 watt seconds or 200, but I think a lot of people can make 200 work, no problem. And 500 is usually the higher end of what's available. Okay, next would be Dawn. What's the best way to avoid shadows in the background? Okay, so there are several things that help avoid shadows in the background. First of all, when you use soft light sources, it makes the shadows a little bit more diffuse and less noticeable. So that's thing number one, softer light helps you. Moving the subject further from the background helps you have less shadows. Changing the angle of your main light, moving it off to the side, will kick the shadow so it's out of your frame. That helps. Or raising the light up a little bit so the shadow is down out of the frame. That helps. So it's all of those things together. Next one is Marisa. What type of giant umbrella do you recommend? To be honest, it doesn't entirely matter. I know that like that sounds sacrilegious, but different ones do different things. Like, for example, a large shoot-through umbrella. What's nice about that, like Westcott makes one that's, I think it's like $99 and it's 7 foot. And so it's a huge soft light source. But when it's shoot through, when you point the light through it, the light bounces everywhere in your space. So if you have white walls, like that, the light is just going to bounce. But maybe you like that look. Maybe you like to have a white reflector on either side of the frame and then it bounces and it fills in. I also recommend that umbrella sometimes for going outside. You pop it up and it's a big diffuser. So people love that because you put it in between. I'm talking no light at all. You just put it in between the sun and your subject. It hits the umbrella and it becomes a large soft light source. So that's a good one. But then at the same time, most of the time I'm using a somewhere between like a 65 and 72 inch white, a white umbrella, but I almost always add a diffuser because basically that makes it a big soft light source, like a softbox. I don't usually use silver. It's more like if I want to go with hard and specular, I go with a harder, more specular light. And if I want to go soft, I go for a softer light. So yeah, it's not that it doesn't matter. It's just there isn't really a right answer. It kind of depends on what you do. Next question from Jeff Nickel. Do you prefer paper for your high key black and white shots? How do you avoid wrinkles and waves? Okay. I get asked this question all the time and I am still confused. I never have wrinkles or waves. I don't know. I'm so confused. Do people store these maybe horizontally? I always store them vertically. And I don't store them in like a garage where there's a lot of humidity, but I don't have wrinkles. I'm not like, I get this question. So it's obviously a problem, but I don't run into it. I use Savage Universal backgrounds. I store them vertically in a place that is relatively climate controlled. And I do prefer paper. I use paper for, basically I'll use a hand painted canvas background if it's meant to have that like old world feel. Otherwise I use seamless paper all the time. Dennis or Denise, what do you think about the MagMod system? Does that compare to Westcott? So the compare question is kind of, it's apples and oranges. It's not the same thing. I think it would compare a little bit more to the new ProPhoto OCF2 system. So basically what it is you have the MagMod has like an adapter on the front that has magnets in it. And then all of the modifiers pop on real fast. And it's using magnets in those as well. I'm going to say this. I have not tested everything. I think the MagMod system works great with small modifiers, like little things that you need to quickly attach, because there's no like put it on, hold this thing, rotate it, pop, like there's none of that. It just pops into place. I think the bigger modifiers, holding it on with the magnets, it depends. Like I know there was an issue with a couple of things with that. I think the Rapid Box solution for pop-ups are really nice. It's quick and easy. So I would try it if you can and actually test it out. So the Westcott that you were speaking of as far as portable modifiers. Oh, okay. Yeah. I was finishing the question. Yeah. it just kind of depends on what you're looking for. I also want to mention, for those of you who are aiming for more portable, I think that when I say portable, most every single thing I've told you about applies to speed lights as well as strobes. Like either way, it's applicable. That being said, I do use strobes in the studio, and I generally like how strobes fill modifiers better. And I like the power output better. I like how they attach to modifiers better. Um, I just think that, when you take them out on location, I totally understand why speed lights are a good choice, but they are making a lot of much more portable strobe options recently. So neither one's right or wrong. You just got to kind of go through the list. I actually have a webinar that I do periodically about the top 10 questions when purchasing studio lighting, and then like helping you place what is right for you. And it's not, gear's constantly changing, right? So it's not about like what's newest. It's about the questions to ask for like power versus portability versus cost, that kind of thing. And then Stephen Lucas says, what patterns of gobos do you suggest? So here's the thing. There are such things as gobos that are actual cutouts that go, for example, the MagMod system has it. You can put the gobos on the little speed light thing and it'll project that onto the subject. And then there are actual light modifiers that allow you to do this, but the term gobo could just be a piece of cardboard that you cut a shape out of. So I think when you say like what patterns, like I think if you get too patterny, you do have to, like, there's a place for it. You do have room to get creative, but I think if you go with really crazy patterns, it restricts what your ability to do with it really is. Instead, I think starting with things like circles and little slices of light, like little bars of light, or like the Venetian blinds, I think those give you a really good place to start because it allows you to get like just really crisp pieces of light rather than like, okay, I have, a floral pattern, which can be beautiful, but it only has so far it can go. Whereas I think there's a lot more you can do with simple shapes. So I think, let's see. Good. I think that wraps us up with all of the questions. So thank you guys so much for watching. And I really appreciate it. I hope that everyone is doing well. What I recommend that you do, especially if you are unfamiliar with studio lighting, is get a mannequin head, get something that's not going to stress you out so that you can test out these elements of control without feeling like you have to rely on someone else's time. When you learn about modifiers and modifying the light and distance of light and your angle of light and the feathering and all of those things, it really takes time. And I think that if you can give yourself a few hours a week, 3-4 hours a week to try to get to know this a little bit better, once you have a subject in your space or ready for a shoot, then you can focus more on the concept and sculpting the light rather than these essentials, which you should probably start to master beforehand. So thank you everyone so much for joining. And again, this will be live available until January 31st. So if you know any other photographers that would benefit from this, feel free to send them this way. And again, if you want to see this as a lighting recipe guide or as a video course, if you go to lindsayadler.photo/one light, you can learn more. So